My name is Matt Wilson. I'm a vice president in SimVentions. There's a picture from perhaps maybe more than just a week ago. Um, I'm not going to read my whole bio, but I've been doing tech development for over 30 years. And that's probably good enough. You can read my bio some other time if you really care. So let's just step back a little bit to the beginning. What are standards? What is a standard? Because that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So this is what I mean about what is a standard. So one, I pulled a definition off of the internet. Looks like Merriam-Webster's dictionary. One of their definition is something set up and established by authority as a rule for the measure, quality, quantity, weight, extent, value of something. Well, that's a pretty good definition of standard. But then when I think about it in the context of what are we doing here at the OMG or as a technology standards body, I just made this up last night. So if it's not good, we'll just pretend it was really late at night. But if it's perfect, we'll blame it on the APA I had in the bar. So to me, standards that we work on are specifications that clearly define and normalize an agreed to pattern of technical behavior or an annotation for a specific purpose. So that's what I think about when I say standard. So when you hear me say the word, that's the framework that my brain is working from. I apologize if it's different than your framework, but at least you'll know what I think I'm talking about. And what is the value of standards? I think we all want to do it, and it's great. But really, I think standards open up and broaden markets. They can reduce acquisition cost of the things you're buying. Think about if we didn't have standards for the size that your toilet fits on. We would have all these crazy plumbing things going on in the world. So that increases adoption and implementation and integration. Portability across providers. Here's a big one. Helps avoid, or at least the perception of avoiding, lock-in. I see some smiles in the room. Standards, you think you're avoiding lock-in, and you are to some extent, but there is some lock-in you always get when something works. It's hard to move, but at least you might have an option with standards to avoid some of that. And the really standards open up the opportunity for new innovations. And you've got a way to get your innovation into the system. So one of the big things a couple of terms we use at the OMG a lot are PIM and PISM. So if you're not an OMG expert and haven't been doing this for a long time, this is what we mean by those terms. A PIM is a platform independent model. So that's an abstraction of an idea that can apply to lots of different solutions, but at least it provides some consistency of terms, of concepts, of architectural patterns for a category of a problem space. So that's a PIM. And then a platform specific model is taking that platform independent model and then describing it in a more specific platform. So for example, at the Defense and Military Task Force, we have PIMs described, so for the TACSIT display PIM. So that's the pattern of how do I describe tactical entities on a plot for the operator to use. So we've got general terms and patterns and models for those, but we have PIMs for how does that express itself if I were doing it in DDS? How would that express itself for doing in Corba? Or if I was going to do a Java-based model of that. So those are three different PISMs, or platform-specific models of the general platform independent model. So they all conform to the PIM, but it gives you flexibility to implement for your platform. So I'll stop over-explaining that and move on. So I just thought I'd take a minute and try to show how just some of the OMG standards that are managed and worked through the OMG actually have opened up markets and created opportunities, whether you're a niche provider or you're a big component platform provider. So first I'll start with Corba. Steve talked about Corba earlier today, and people think, well, Corba is just ancient, but it's actually it's used because it's understood and it works, and it's somewhat straightforward. And so, with the existence of this standard, there's actually an ecosystem of official Corba providers out there that comply with the standards. There's actually several people who aren't even OMG members that have taken that Corba standard, and they have products out in the marketplace for it. So Corba is an example of how standards have created a market. Next, I'll talk about DDS, the Data Distribution Service. So I'm not going to take any credit for this standard existing, but I've had a front row seat to watching this thing grow and evolve over the last 20 years or so. A couple of companies had a great technology that was working. People want it standardized, so they weren't locked in. So they brought it here to the object management group. Those vendors got together, and there's, I don't know how many DDS related standards are there, Char. So there's at least 10 specifications related to the DDS standard. Yeah. So for everything from real-time DDS to security profiles and all kinds of quality of service standards. So DDS has been a very rich and powerful standard that's opened up a huge marketplace, and DDS is now used across a wide variety of systems in a consistent manner. Exciting stuff. And then everybody has heard of UML. So Booch and Rumbaugh got together way back in 95 and 97. They combined their methodologies of doing clouds and boxes and decided to agree on a standardized way to do it. And then they brought those methodologies to the OMG and established the UML standards, which then evolved into SysML standards. And now we've got a huge marketplace of tooling and vendors that provide capabilities in these markets. So standards can open up markets. So why do I care? We're a fairly small business. SimVentions, we're only about 300 folks. I've got about 50 people in my group who are kind of building niche tools to address specific customer needs, because yes, you can get general purpose tools, but you often need special things in any special environment. We do a lot of DoD work. So we do niche tools. Standards enable opportunities for little guys like us. So if I know there's a market out there of umpteen DDS tools out there, and they all conform to this standard, we actually came up with this clever little visualization technique to take the DDS messages that are going across the network and visually graph your DDS network. What's being published, what's being subscribed to, what are the steps in between, what topics, who cares about what. And so because of that existence of that standard, as a niche provider, we were able to make that tool and we plugged it in and it works. It's pretty cool. I'm not here to sell the tool because we haven't updated in a while because our customers changed focus a little bit. But that's an example of how that standard opened up that opportunity for us. And we made some good stuff. And hopefully it's at least been a change agent to some of the big guys to put those kinds of capabilities in their tool set, because that's what we need as customers of that. And that really enabled that innovation. We had this idea, we saw the market here and said, hey, let me throw my idea into that market in a way for it to work very quickly and effectively. And then finally, standards actually help open up interoperability. So especially when we're talking about here in the DevSecOps world, there's a chain of things that need to happen for that pipeline to operate. I need to be able to easily get things from one step to the next step to the next step and flow it through. Well, if I have different pieces and parts, without a standard, I can't get those steps to interoperate with each other. So I think those are three perspectives that I have as kind of like that niche provider. I could either help make things plugins to pipelines that might exist. Maybe I can have some technology which will actually help smooth some of those things in the pipeline. Maybe there's some transformations that need to happen. But with standards, then I'd have a target to shoot at instead of picking one vendor's implementation or another, or how do I make Git work with this, or the Microsoft steps work with that, or any of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to kind of walk us through what probably most of you in this room have experienced in your career, unless you jumped right into an organization that had a robust DevOps world going on. So I was a software developer way back in the day. Matt can attest, they don't let me do that anymore.
30 or 40 years
Yeah.
ago.
Oh. We're gonna have a meeting after this, Matt, and we need to talk. But Matt's actually one of my star developers, and he takes care of a lot of my DevOps stuff back at the office. So if anything is technically inaccurate, he tried to keep me out of trouble, but it's really actually my fault, and I just managerized some of this, and he's really my brain. Right. Is the idiot test on does it make sense? Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that, Ian. Gonna have to talk later as well. So as developers, we start off, we know we need at least some source control. Got a way to check in and out my source code. When we first start right out of college, we think we can just keep building like crazy on our own machine. Then we realize I need version control. So we implement some source control. And then usually our IDE gives us some really nice build systems and makes it really easy to build the thing. And realize automated builds are great. And then when I build something, I need a repo of what I've built so that I can keep track of what I built. So that's about the basics of where we start in the software world. Then we grow a little bit more. We get a little bit more mature. Things are going well, and I realize, I need to actually have a more consistent way to do issue management, issue tracking. Whether that's Jira or a spreadsheet from heck, Word documents or whatever. But eventually, we all mature into getting to an issue manager, and then when we start delivering these things to customers, we need to have some better configuration management. So we throw some CM stuff in the pipeline there. And then we realize, we're actually getting kind of mature. There's some big vendor products out there that's going to make this all really easy. But, they've got all the things I need, and they fill in the holes of stuff that I really am starting to see the light. I need to do this more. But you know what? My build system is pretty cool and unique, and it's not going to work in that big vendor system. So I need, like, my favorite thing that I really want to keep when I go from here to there doesn't plug into there. So, but I see the value of the big system. It's wonderful. I'll redo that work, and we move into the big vendor system. Yay, it's great. Well, as we all know, our bosses always have better ideas for us. And my boss says, I love the trend analysis and dashboards that other big vendor system gives me that I don't have in the big vendor system that I'm living in right now. So we're just gonna move from this big vendor system to this big vendor system. And Ben's back there shaking his head, and we all know. Yes. And then so we've just now asked our dev team to now redo like months and months of work to get all the stuff they finally got working over here to work now in this new big vendor system, so we can get the fancy dashboards. So perhaps that resonates with some of you online or in the room. So how do we get out of that problem space? So cool thing about standards in the OMG is we don't like to just invent stuff because it's a good idea. We like to work on standards in markets that are somewhat mature. So DevOps has been going on for 10 years. It's about time we get some coming together on this thing. So I throw out some potential areas we could look at standardizing. One is like, what are the steps in the pipeline? What do we call them? What's the definition of the boundary of each one? Why do I care about them? Logging would be huge if I had a standardized way of logging data. So, Anil was just talking about RegOps. So big thing in regulation and compliance and demonstrating that you're secure is that you've got all the logs that showed everything that happened. So we could do some standardized related to logging or pushing data in and out of any of the repositories that you have. So whether it's your backlog, your Jira type stuff, or your code, your artifacts, your deployment, if I've got standardized way to pull those artifacts or push things into them, that could really help. And governance, policy enforcement, that kind of goes back to Anil's talk a moment ago. And then being able to plug things into this pipeline. So let me put some words behind this a little bit. So what could we standardize? Getting some consistent terms about what is the pipeline and the steps of a pipeline, and maybe come up with some platform independent models or PIMs of that kind of stuff. So whether I'm doing it in Amazon or Microsoft or Red Hat, maybe those are different PISMs, but they all map back to this platform independent model of what does it mean to do a DevSecOps pipeline. So that's one potential low-hanging fruit. I think a huge enabler to get there is coming up with the metadata or the taxonomy or ontology of that stuff. So what is an issue and what's a commit, what's a build, what is a release? So those terms actually have meaning with consistency that's agreed to across the industry, rather than, the reason every company has their own definition of DevOps is because it's a common practice, and they're very similar, but they're slightly different. One of the areas is a common way to have the metadata about failures and errors and issues that come up or problems that come up through the pipeline. If I had a common taxonomy of those, then I could actually start getting into the things that Neil was talking about. How do I know which ones I care about? And is a consistency of a problem show me a bigger trend in the situation? Or as David was talking about this morning, I've already demonstrated that problem is not a problem. So if I get consistency, I've got a way to tag it that's not really a problem anymore. We've already demonstrated that's not an issue. Several years ago, the Defense Task Force, we came out with this test IF standard. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Rec IF. So it's a requirements IF interface format for the exchange of requirements. So we did an analog of that in the testing space. It's a really good standard, but it kind of got put on the shelf. It's kind of gone dormant for some time, but perhaps it'd be a good place to maybe just dust that off, tweak it a little bit as it relates to working in a CI/CD pipeline or a DevOps pipeline. I think we could look at some standards to help with the scripting process, getting things to work. So if I do a ton of work to get the transitions to work in one pipeline, I don't have to redo all of that work if I go to another one. That would require some common language for things. Let's see what I got here. I think this would go toward what David was talking about this morning about artifact publishing. So if I had a common, consistent way to get a build log, what is all in this build, and that I've got different QA evidence and test results evidence. So when I go to compliance and I go to get my ATO, and I've got my continual ATO to keep all of the certification bubbas happy, I've got a standardized technological automated way to get there. If we're going to go with the sec piece, the security integration, where, how, what would I do to integrate security? We've come a long way to do automated antivirus checking of things. Is there a consistent way to make sure that's just turned on and working? Vulnerability analysis. So I won't describe everything on here. Let's just say it's a target-rich environment, and that can kind of be a little bit daunting. Like, okay, well, you've just pointed out 13, 15, 20 things we should work on. So I sat down with Matt last night and I said, okay, you got to start somewhere. As a user of a pipeline, where do you think a good place to start would be? So if we could start looking at just the platform independent model of the terms, the steps, or the taxonomy of the terms in the DevSecOps space, and come down that, so we can have a definition of what those mean and some evidence that I'm doing those steps and that I can progress from one to the other. We think that would be a big useful step. Maybe industry is actually 90% there, and we just need to come together and put it into one common PIM spec, and everybody bless us, say, yes, that's it. Then we can make progress from there. I think related, but a little bit different. So I'm looking at this from a niche vendor, or even from what Anil and David were looking for this morning. If we can start to come up with the metadata or the data attributes about activities through the DevOps pipeline, whether that's build results, I'm not going to show my ignorance on what those would be, but if we can come up with common metadata about stuff in a pipeline and language to get it out of the tools, like common APIs or common data structures, when I get it out, then I can actually do interesting things with it in a consistent way. I could provide evidence for compliance. I could provide evidence for my continual ATO. I can provide evidence to my boss that we are actually building something and it's working in a consistent way. So that's kind of my speed date of kind of setting out the challenge for all of us here. No one of us is smart enough to get it, but we all have to get in the room and decide where we want to start. So those are my two suggestions on where we get started, and certainly we can go where we go and see what happens. But any questions or discussions anybody wants to throw out on the table?
Super interesting, especially if you can to TO and insurance
Yeah.
focus. Each command has their own responsibility. With different risk balances. Things like driving comfortable into the process would help you faster.
Right. By having those common terms, people will start speaking the same language and feel more comfortable that my ATO really is based on real things, not just people checking a box because we need it working. Back to back.
So one area where I have seen a little bit of interest in start in that space is the idea of adaptation as part of software supply chain security. So it starts with the idea of third-party software components. It starts with the idea that from like third-party software components, like where are you getting them from? Like how were they built? What got integrated? But then it goes on to, okay, as part of that build, test, assemble process, what build steps were run? Can I sign those build logs? Can I show like who signed all the commits? And if you get, I think, all the way to that, that complete supply chain attested and signed, digitally signed, you would have to have a lot of the standards that you're talking about, right? Just in order to get there, right?
Anyone else? Good conversation. Hopefully we can, it's my shameless plug to get involved. If this resonates with anybody online or here in the room, come one, come all. Yeah.
Slide about what standards do, no more than sort of click that standards actually improve competition.
Yeah.
Let me give you a case in point. For years, I was with Lockheed Martin, and our early modeling was done with a tool called Rhapsody, originally developed by iLogix. Great tool for real-time embedding. Somebody else bought it, and then IBM bought it. And IBM for a while did a good job of maintaining it. And then on the board of directors, I got talking because I noticed that they were becoming unresponsive to customers' requests for new capability. And a small company at the time out of North Texas called Magic Draw had developed a tool called, No Magic developed a tool called Magic Draw that became Cameo. And they were hungry. And because they were built to the UML standard and SysML, eventually a lot of the Lockheed units, because IBM became non-responsive to customers, we could port our stuff with the interchange from one modeling tool to the other. And I just checked recently, Rhapsody, which had a really large market share, last year had 0.02% of the market share in real-time modeling. So that standard actually helps customers. If you get, if you don't stay competitive, we can change to another vendor that meets the standards. So it actually encourages competitiveness.
So you're trying to talk the vendors into standards?
He's got it. I want the vendors to come. And I know Bill's with him. I work for Bill Consulting, but Bill used to say, we welcomed when we did open source orbs and things like that, because customers could try and see if they like Corba on an open source. And if they did, then they could come to us and we could show how we could outperform most of the, for your real commercial applications. So that standard really does benefit any kind of a vendor, to help with that competitiveness. Yeah.
To build on what Ben was saying here, I remember many, many years ago when I was still with Tiger, that I was talking with a very large UML vendor. I won't say who. And anyway, though, so UML 2.0 had just come out, and I had assumed that every vendor who was involved in the development of UML 2.0 were actually working to get their products to be UML 2.0 compliant, or conform, whatever term you want to use. Anyway, so I asked them. I said, I was at a meeting, and I said, so I'm assuming that that you're implementing all of UML 2.0. And the fellow looked at me and said, no. He says, what parts of it would you like us to do, and what would you like to pay us to do it? And I thought, this is absolutely bloody insane. We would like to use your product right now, but if you're not going to, if you're going to make us have to pay you and then wait for God knows how long to actually implement that spec, what's the point? We'll go over to some other tool manufacturer, vendor, and if they've been keeping up with the spec, they're the ones that we're going to buy from, not you.
Anyway, it was a fourth bullet point that we should consider.
Yeah,